Hey, Bob.
Yellow.
Looks like. So I guess we're at time. We give people a couple more minutes to wander in.
Yeah, 2 more minutes and we start.
Why doesn't that open? Nope.
All right, let's start this show. Welcome to the first meeting of the Secure Shell Maintenance Working Group at IETF 121 in Dublin, in Ireland. Big thank you to the people attending remotely in vastly different time zones. Hopefully next meeting is more convenient for you than this one. We are operating under a note well. And in a nutshell, this means that we expect all participants in the working group to treat each other with respect, no fallacies, no ad hominem, try to be excellent to each other. Another important tidbit, please scan the QR code at the microphone so that we sort of have an indication how many people attended. This will help us with planning the next meeting. The note well can be read if you follow the URL on the bottom left. So what is this all about? Over the course of the last 18 to 12 months, some people expressed appetite to revisit parts of the IETF specifications that define the SSH protocol. And a working group eventually was set up, this one, to update the RFCs, some of which are almost 2 decades old, and revise or realign the specifications with how things are done in the wild. Another goal of this working group is to update and maintain the list of cryptographic algorithms used by SSH. This is my co-chair, Stefan Farrell. I am Job Snyders. We have a mailing list, ssh@ietf.org, and our area director, so that's who Stefan and I report to, Deb Cooley. Thank you for being here. The working group was formed a couple of weeks ago, and we started our first calls for working group document adoption. We've gone through 2 calls for adoption, one for a draft called Draft Miller SSH Agent, and the other one is Draft Josephson NTRU Prime SSH. Both have been adopted by the working group, and as chairs, we have requested the authors to submit a 0.0 version of these documents with the appropriate file name.
Simon just did that for the entry file.
Yes, Simon was very quick to act, and I clicked the button on my side, but Damian Miller still needs to type in a few commands in the computer. So thank you for participating in these discussions, whether they should have been working group documents or not. And that brings us to upcoming work. Earlier on in the discussions around the formation of this working group, I tried to compile a list of outstanding work items that were floating around somewhere that maybe this working group can take on to align specifications with implemented reality. We, as chairs, would like to consider drafts that are not expired. So anything on this list that's expired should get a refresh before we proceed with call for working group adoption. And I want to make it clear that the initiative for progressing these documents is with the working group participants. The second item, the secure shell file exfer, from my notes from the interim meeting at the last IETF, it appears there was a file transfer protocol concept being defined. The 0.2 version is what some implementations embraced, and variants thereof were deployed in the wild. However, that draft apparently progressed, and more features and more aspects were added to that. But the sense I got from the room back then was that we should maybe consider forking off this version and not later versions. But that's up to the working group. In our charter, we have a note to work on standardizing SSH certificates, which are not X509 certificates, but a different format. The certificate key format is outlined in protocol.cert keys. If you download the slides, these links are clickable. And in order to progress this towards standardization, to comply with our charter, that document would need to be converted to internet draft format. Theodorat brought up that a thing called strict key exchange might also benefit from being specified in documents, but there's no draft that I know of, but please correct me if I'm wrong on that. No draft, all right. Then today's agenda, we want to talk a little bit about how this working group will operate. Damian Miller is going to talk about the SSH agent protocol. Theodorat wanted to share a few words about deprecating certain ciphers. And then there is room for any other business. We were hoping for presentations from the NTRU Prime draft and MLChem draft, but the presenters could not attend, so hopefully that will happen next IETF. And after that, we'll be done for today. This is me in Ireland, so I thought it was an appropriate photo to share with you. So,
do you want to just check if anybody has to bash the agenda?
Yeah, we can check that. Any other things people would like to add to this agenda?
In that case, no. Okay.
All right. So, how do we get work done? And the IETF gives a lot of leeway to individual working groups and as to how they want to organize themselves, what kind of tooling they want to use. So what I put up here is not law, but it's what we as chairs, as a starting point, propose to participants. We use the data tracker to track which documents exist, what their current state is, whether they're adopted or not adopted. The data tracker is also where reviews go from dictoriates. Is that how I pronounce it?
Directorates.
Directorates, thank you. And the data tracker is, for instance, also what the IASG uses to indicate whether they support publication of a document as RFC or not. So The data tracker is a must use. We encourage authors of documents to create a data tracker account. Although, as far as I'm aware, it is not mandatory to have an account. As long as you have a functional email address, you can interact with the data tracker system.
But you need a data tracker account to be here, pretty much, or for any interim meetings we might have. So pretty much anybody who wants to actively participate ends up with one of those.
Then as to the tooling that authors can use. From our perspective as chairs, we're fine with people using GitHub to store the original source of their internet draft, or GitLab, or private repositories, RSC, or no repository. Like it's up to the authors to use tooling they feel comfortable with. In a similar fashion, we will not tell you what text editor to use. As for the format, the IETF participants at large have created a lot of tooling to produce internet drafts. So there's a tool called XML to RFC if you like writing in XML. But there's also tooling that converts Markdown or Pandoc or other formats into the internet draft format that is uploaded into the data tracker. And again, use the tools that you feel comfortable with. And if you like advice or recommendations or have questions about tooling, then you can always email the chairs with your questions. Some authors, when they manage a document, like to use an issue tracker. Some don't. It's again up to the individual editors that are driving a document forward to sort of organize how they want to track outstanding items. And you know, it may differ from draft to draft what's convenient, but we are not prescribing a specific mechanism. As to sending feedback on internet drafts, there's probably 3 ways to do it. If the authors are using something like GitHub or GitLab, you can probably open an issue there. That's one way, or send a pull request. You can email authors directly. For every draft, certain email addresses are generated to reach the authors in one go. Or you send feedback to the public mailing list, ssh@ietf.org. The big advantage of sending feedback to the public mailing list is that it's archived and that more people get eyes on the feedback that you contribute to a given internet draft. But it's up to working group participants to decide what the scope of their message is. So it's entirely imaginable that somebody emails the authors privately like, hey, I think the bike shed should be blue and not green, and that there's disagreement. And then the issue is discussed in a broader group, the public mailing list, to see where consensus may be, if there is consensus to be reached.
We should ask people if they want this.
Yes, that's my next slide.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess on
the slide.
On the previous slide, I mean, I guess most IETF working groups can do these things differently. Some are way more GitHub-y than others. Our sense is that this might match this group of people. And I guess the only other thing to say is that it's all very well to kind of fix typos and nits or something via pull requests. That's entirely fine. Anything substantive really should be on the mailing list. So
ideally,
yeah. Well, no. If there's a substantive difference, it has to be on the mailing list so that we can have agreed it.
Sure.
Yeah. So small things are fine in pull requests or whatever. Anything interesting probably should be on the list at some point.
Another aspect that is key to this working group and is not done in all IETF working groups, but we require implementations to exist before documents are progressed towards IESG or IETF-wide review. Implementation reports can exist in a few forms, and we're not particular how exactly to communicate to the group what the implementation status of a document is, but a really good way to do it is by including a implementation status section in your internet draft. RFC 7942 has some boilerplate that you can copy paste as to how to put that in your document. An advantage of incorporating implementation status reports in the internet draft itself is that it makes things easier for reviewers later on in the process. But there's a cool website, the SSH comparison at Quendi. This is managed by a third party. This is not an IETF driven initiative, but it shows a giant matrix of what is SSH implementation support, what ciphers and features. So that's another way for the working group to sort of get a grasp on whether an idea is purely an idea or whether it's deployed in the wild or not. And then finally, another way of communicating to the working group what implementation status is of a certain internet draft is to just create a page on our wiki, the URL at the bottom of the slide. It's free form, and you can create a page relevant, specific to your internet draft, where you tell the story of what implementation status is. So the goal is to ship things that are real, that are interoperable, and how exactly it is communicated, what's real and what's interoperable, is left. There's a degree of leeway for the participants. So, any questions or comments or suggestions so far on our proposed path forward?
It'd be good if people said it seems okay. Yes.
Okay, we see a thumbs up.
Rich.
Well,
Bob is in the queue also.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We have input. That's always good to get input.
Bob, go ahead.
So when I go and fork a 5-year-old version of OpenSSH, add my stuff to it, put it on my GitHub, does that count as an implementation?
Yes.
Even if nobody's using it or has it deployed anywhere but me?
Ultimately, the ISG will make a decision as to whether something should be published as RFC or requires more work or not. So the goal for internet draft authors is to somehow relay what the status of something is, and it's perfectly fine to fork an older version of some SSH implementation to essentially create a proof of concept, but it would be appreciated if it is clearly marked as, this is what I did. I forked an old version and I did this for the purpose of creating a proof of concept. But as to what exactly constitutes an implementation, ultimately is something that the working group can discuss amongst themselves in, for instance, working group last call. And if you were to fork an old version of SSH, then your friends or colleagues would be free to point out, like, hey, Bob, this doesn't seem entirely real. But so I can't tell you like clear-cut rules. This is what we recognize as implementation. This is what we don't recognize as implementation. We'll cross those bridges when we get there.
Were you planning to do that, Bob?
No, well, I might have done it a long time in the past, but no plans recently. No plans in the near future, but I just wanted some clarity on what counts as an implementation here, or at least an acknowledgement that we need to discuss it. We need to think about this.
Sure. Thanks. Damien.
I broadly agree with the modus operandi that the chairs have outlined. I guess just I thought Bob was referring to the. I don't think he was, but I thought initially he was referring to the situation with OQS OpenSSH, which has actually come up when in the implementation of the MLChem key exchange. One of the implementations I kind of cited as interoperating was OQS OpenSSH, which is a fork of several years old OpenSSH with post-quantum algorithms added. So it's not an entirely theoretical concern.
Well, to address some of this concern, let's imagine an SSH stack implements a cool feature, and somebody copies that repository and renames OpenSSH to closed SSH. Then I would argue like this doesn't count as an extra implementation. But if two projects forked from each other and diverged over the course of the years, and the feature was implemented by two different people, that to me would count towards two implementations that demonstrate interoperability. So again, it's when people report on implementation status, it's kind of good to share the history of the implementation, who worked on it, and if ultimately the goal of the IETF is to produce interoperable standards, and we achieve that by having multiple people read the same document and try and implement it, maybe in different languages, maybe in different projects, and that is what establishes the sort of quality of a specification. So it may happen that projects that forked from each other 5 years ago are perfectly reasonable independent implementations of new work in the future, or maybe not. We'll take it case by case.
Okay. Rich?
Yeah, Rich Sauls. So I think casting a broad net for getting people to submit documents is the right thing to do, especially given the fraught history with IETF and the OpenSSH developer community. As someone who's unlikely to write a document, but probably will comment on them, it'd be great if there were a mandatory least common denominator that I could send my comments to. Either you require every draft to say where feedback should be sent, or you require put it on the mailing list, and the document authors should review that to make sure that they're seeing comments from the working group. That's probably also most in line with classic IETF stuff, and it's a fairly low burden. But overall, you know, a wide funnel to take things in makes a lot of sense. But as how people look at it and how they contribute to it, just make it easy for that too.
Yeah, agreed. Ultimately, the lowest common denominator is our mailing list. And that's a perfectly fine place to send feedback. But if the authors have indicated in the data tracker, like here's the repository or here's our issue tracker, then people can use those as well.
Yeah, I was just concerned about it because of a comment you made earlier, which is, oh, you can just mail the document authors directly. And I'd like to discourage that and say, put it on the list and make the document authors monitor the list.
Yes, document authors should definitely monitor the mailing list. That's helpful. My comment as to send things specifically directly to the authors, it really depends on the feedback. If it's grammar, spelling, I don't know. And I think we're all adults here and can sort of recognize like this is, I'm not going to introduce noise into the mailing list, or this is something that everybody should see. But we can always course correct if we notice that somehow the feedback loops are not working as we would like them to work.
I mean, I guess we're also not expecting to be snowed under with drafts. I don't think we're going to have dozens and dozens. So I think something fairly loose should work. Deb.
So Deb Cooley, it is possible to get, yeah, well, I'm short, right? Sometimes I stand on my tiptoes. It is possible to get a GitHub organization made by the IETF, so then you can transfer GitHub repos into it. So it gives you one place to keep them all together. If you want to do that, that's a message that we send, easy peasy. Just let me know, or Stephen can do it, or whatever. But it does give you an option to have things all together in one place, right?
Yeah, and a bunch of working groups do that. I guess our sense was just from the initial feedback that it's kind of variable for now, and if people migrate towards that, we can do it later on if need be. Well, sometimes that can be confusing if people think this stuff is over here and it's really over there. So.
All right, we're gonna start.
Okay, so I'll be in the queue for that. Great.
Hand over the microphone to Damien.
Was actually just one more on that last bit of, I'm taking the notes. They'll go to the mailing list. If people who aren't here at the session today disagree, they can disagree on the mailing list, and we'll talk about it there as well. So, same as with everything we talk about today. So,
is there a way to make
yes,
him,
you up there.
user
Left,
management?
one more left there. Yeah.
Slides.
Oh,
I
cool.
think you
can-
should be able to click next yourself.
I see controls. I'll see if they work in a moment. Yeah, thanks everyone, and please bear with me as I deal with lack of sleep and unfamiliar slide controls. So this is I guess I wanted to go through the presentation fairly quickly on the SSH agent protocol, so we've got time to talk about it. SSH agent protocol has been around for well over 20 years at this point. So I think this falls very much into the category of documenting very widely deployed practice. So I'll introduce the protocol, talk about the extension mechanism, talk about deployment, talk about some of the extensions, and hopefully foster a good discussion on standardizing it. So the SSH agent protocol is used for two things. One as a way of storing unwrapped private keys, which traditionally like the proliferation of cheap smart cards and tokens used to live encrypted at rest, typically on one's own hard drive in the home directory and on Unix-like systems. And the SSH agent is a place where you can unwrap those keys once, load them into an agent, which provides use of those keys without the ability to pull them back out again, pull the private key material back out again. The analogy I like to use is that of a user hardware security module, and it makes key use easy, a little bit more secure in my opinion, because you're not typing passphrases in constantly to unwrap these things, and the agent can be made small and readily audited. The other way the agent is used in the SSH protocol is that it can be forwarded along with your connection. So your keys can kind of follow you around as you go from host to host to host. Now, obviously, that presents some risks. That convenience also allows, on-host attackers that if you've on hosts where you've forwarded an agent to gain access to those or gain use of those keys, and that the agent protocol leaves that decision up to the user. There's some extensions that restrict this, but I'm not going to cover them in these slides because they're fairly invasive to other parts of the SSH protocol. The SSH agent protocol, as is standardized, is an evolution of the old SSH agent 1, SSH version 1 agent protocol. It's very simple. The client initiates basically everything, and the server responds. There's a one-to-one relationship between client requests and server responses. Reuses all of the SSH wire encoding primitives, and implements a number of fairly basic operations that you'd expect: adding keys in, listing them, deleting them, deleting all of them, and signing are the primary ones. There's a couple of places where extensibility matters in the agent protocol. In the actual request types is one of them. There's signature flags. There's options that get added to keys as they're added. And there's and the draft specifies an extension discovery mechanism. One interesting thing that this protocol does is define a wire encoding for private keys as well, because you need to add private keys into the agent. You need to be able to serialize them, and I think so far the SSH protocol's there is a format for there is a private key file format that not everyone implements. I think this may be compatible, but I haven't checked. So this is a typical client request message. It's encoded as a very common length type contents packet. This one's to sign some data. Keys are referenced by their public key as is defined in RFC 4253, I think. So the standard public keys are identified not by an integer handle, but by their full public key blob, and that's true pretty much everywhere except for smart card keys. Yeah, not much to say about this. It should be fairly self-explanatory. Flags is one of the points of potential extensibility in this particular message. Server response takes exactly the same framing. Most responses are pretty short. Like the success message is an empty contents. Some like this one will provide some data back to the client. This is the full list of requests and responses in the base protocol. So it's a fairly short list, and nothing I think unexpected there. I guess the smart card stuff is a little bit of a bolt onto the protocol. Adding smart card keys is done by when you add a smart card key, you specify a string which somehow represents a smart card reader. That could be a path to a PKCS11 module. That could be a PKCS11 URI. The protocol leaves it up to the agent implementation itself. This is the sort of request level extension request. There's actually a mistake there. The contents contains a string which identifies the extension using the same name at domain extension mechanism that the rest of the SSH protocol uses. The draft specifies one extension name, not in the domain at domain style, which is query, which can be used to return a list of extensions that that the agent supports. Nobody implements that query at the moment, but the mechanism is defined so that a unsupported extension will return a generic failure message. So it degrades reasonably gracefully if an implementation doesn't support a particular extension. You get a response back, or you get something useful back. Another extension mechanism is key constraints. These are little bits of data that are included when a key is added to an agent, and there is a mechanism to use named constraints, which can use the SSH style extensibility there as well. All constraints are critical. If a server doesn't support a particular constraint, then it has to refuse to add that key. It can't, in the general case, it can't actually proceed to parse any further constraints because of the way that the constraints are encoded. The rationale here is that if any constraint could be viewed as restricting the use of a key, and if a server doesn't support those restrictions, it shouldn't be adding the key and exposing it in the first place. I guess this is describing how the agent protocol relates and interacts with the surrounding SSH protocols. and some of this is a little bit tied to implementation as it reaches the operating system. I'll talk about the Unix environment because that's what I'm most familiar with. The SSH forwarding is requested on a per channel basis. So typically, if you're requesting a shell or a command execution session, you will have created a channel, an SSH channel for that session, and then you can issue a request over that channel to enable agent forwarding. The server then will, again, I've referred to specific implementation in Unix that we use, will expose a listening socket via an environment variable, and when a connection from the remote server hits the agent, that will create a new channel back to the client. Very, very similar life cycle to remote port forwarding, if you're familiar with that. And then after that channel back to the client has been received, the server typically plays no part in. It doesn't do anything it doesn't modify that data over that session, over that channel whatsoever. It just passes stuff from the server side to the client. Extensions, there's quite a few out there. I'll talk about the OpenSSH one because I won't make a mess of it if I talked of other extensions that I probably would. So we support additional key types beyond what's in the agent draft, including FIDO security keys, which it would be great if the working group got to those at some point. There's also a restricted key mechanism, which is fairly complex and requires some changes elsewhere in the SSH protocol. I think this is interesting because it goes to address one of the big concerns that people have with agent forwarding, is that it's without further work, it's kind of all or nothing. I'm aware of other organizational use of the SSH agent protocol for forwarding access to non-SSH keys, using that property that you've got an agent that follows you around as you connect from host to host to forward access to other credentials. There is a range of message IDs in the draft that is reserved for organizational use to facilitate that kind of stuff. I mentioned at the start it's very widely implemented. I think most SSH implementations that support that have a client, at least have a client support the agent protocol. There's also non-SSH implementations. I believe GNU-PG supports has an agent implementation, and Yubico has a SSH agent implementation that provides access to their FIDO security keys, or their security keys, I should say. I guess on the draft itself, the draft predates the working group for a while and didn't really progress because of my kind of lack of action more than anything else. It has had several rounds of feedback from some of the other SSH implementers, and I thank everyone who's sent me information and fixes for it. Because it makes changes to IANA registries, it was kind of stuck until that got fixed early this year. The draft is very much just what is implemented and a common denominator of what's implemented. It doesn't include any of the OpenSSH implementation extensions, and the only real changes with what's implemented are using the unadorned or unvended names in the draft and documenting that extension query mechanism, which is a little bit ahead of implementation, but I think is a a useful thing to have in there. For when other people start issuing, start implementing extensions of their own. I think that's it. Yeah, that's the slides.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions, comments, or feedback for what Damien presented just now?
Has anybody read the draft recently? One nod, I think. So, okay, so we need to get some more review and stuff. So Damien, sorry, could you go back one?
I think we first have Bob.
Oh, sorry, Bob is in queue. So pardon me. Bob.
I was just raising my hand to wave that I've read the draft because I can't wave at the room.
Thanks.
So it wasn't quite clear to me what the plan should be about the extension things. Did you want to like encourage documenting more of them in this draft or in separate drafts, or I'm not sure what the good plan would be.
I leave that up to the community really. Like I think if there's extensions that people would like to see documented in this draft that don't require like large chunks of implementation. Like I mean, for example, I don't think it would be easy to document a new key type in the context of this draft because it would require documenting the new key type. But if there's something that is useful and implemented by another implementation that someone would like to be in here, then I think we could certainly have that conversation. I guess one thing I didn't address in this slide is I have this as an informational RFC or on the informational track. I don't know whether that's appropriate, and I leave it up to the working group to tell me whether that's right or wrong.
Tero.
I think the actually should be standard track because I think this is something that we should standardize. There is extension that I'd really like to have here is the way to actually limit the keys, because one of the problem with the SSH agent currently defined is the one that you, as you said, it's all or nothing. If you forward your, agent to some host, that host can use any of your keys for any of the purposes. And I understand that you say that then OpenSSH has some way of doing that already. One of the problems is that to actually do that securely doesn't only change the agent protocol, it also changes the SSH agent forwarding protocol, which is not in the SSH agent, but it's actually in the actual, SSH client and server, because they need to be giving out the path how the packet comes through. When you have a request, you want to get all the nodes that it was forwarded to, so you can actually say that, okay, allow this signing request for this key only if it never ever went to any other host than .iki.fi hosts. I trust those hosts. I don't trust any of the others. This key cannot be used for any of the other hosts. This other key can be used only with the hosts that are netbsd.org. This host key can be used IETF.org and so on. These kind of things that you can actually limit, saying this, if you forward the keys through some other mechanism, you are not allowed to do that. You can do that somewhat because there is a constraint that allows you to request and for a verification before you use any of the keys. So you could actually do that kind of thing. But of course, the problem is that you don't know where the request came, except when you happen to do it yourself. At that point, you probably know that that's it, but otherwise you don't know if it's coming. If you get a request to use your agent that you haven't done anything, you probably know that it's somebody using. I quite often misuse this myself in SSHing to some machine where I know that I have my agent forwarded somewhere else, and suggest my agent reuse that agent that is running somewhere else. But I would actually want to make sure that I shouldn't be able to do that easily, and if we want to do that kind of extension, doing it here in the beginning would allow it to be also implemented and my understanding is that if there's something that we can copy from OpenSSH, that would be good. I know that SSH Communication Security had this kind of feature in their agent in early 2000s, like 2001 or 2000. Before actually, when we were actually working on this draft, SSH has their own version of the agent protocol that was doing this kind of thing already. But of course, that's already gone now. I have no idea where the code went. But anyway, I think that. So you said that OpenSSH has some kind of limitation of stuff already, right? You had link in somewhere there pointing to some. Yeah, that's agent restricted HTML. I understand that is actually what is doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, so I guess yeah, and I didn't include it in this. I didn't include it in this draft because, as far as I'm aware, nobody else implements it yet. This agent restriction protocol does require some changes in the server and the client. It basically works by binding the agent session to a path of. It works by binding the agent session to the session ID of the SSH connection, and through that you get basically a chain of host keys of the hosts in which you're going through, and you can cryptographically verify them. Doing that, however, requires the server to intervene in the agent protocol in a fairly minor way. It puts a message in at the start of each agent session. It also requires some changes to the public key authentication method in SSH, so that the host key is included in that signature, so you get the reverse binding, and a server can't kind of lie to you about your authentication challenges signed by the agent can't be replayed against other servers. So it is a bit more invasive. I would like to see it standardized, but I'd like to see someone else implement it first. I would just also point out that that's not the only way you can limit which keys are forwarded where. It's also possible, with outside of the agent protocol, to have an agent that presents different keys to different SSH clients on your own machine. I think that's a possibility that kind of exists outside the protocol specification itself.
Yeah, but that doesn't exist anymore after you have went a couple of hops. Because what usually happens for me, I'm not SSHing from here to my home machine where I am actually SSHing to some other machine where I'm continuing there, and then I'm actually come back to some other machine because I see it being some stuff between that and using this kind of agent in that kind of environment, it requires me to, okay, I have a very limited, set of hosts where I actually forward my agent, and then I sometimes, oh shit, I don't have an agent here because I went through this machine that I don't trust enough. So, but yes, I understand it always requires changes to the client and server, and that's actually one of the actually good thing is because said nobody else implements this as an OpenSSH. Then it is actually something that we can also do, make sure that it's actually done properly. Because I'm not sure, I haven't read the agent restrict, but if you are saying that there is, things that could be done differently, I know that if I remember correctly from 25 years ago, the thing that the SSH Communication Security did was similar things that we do in email received headers. So we added this kind of extra thing in the, when you forwarded the packet, it added, okay, this packet came from this host, and here is the packet. And then the next hop added, this packet came from here, and then there's multiple of these. This packet came from here, and the final one is the signing message.
Sure.
So it didn't modify the packet, it just added something in the before, and then the agent get list of, this is forwarded from here, 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 and then we have the request.
So on that topic, Tero, would you be able to send an email to the list, kind of stating that it'd be nice to have this, and then if we can get another implementation and
I have about four times already starting to write it and then realizing that I don't want to distract the working group now. And now I think it's actually time to do it.
Yeah. So
Earlier when we were doing charter discussion and that kind of thing, no, let's leave it out from here.
Yeah. I think asking the questions go, and maybe ultimately the answer will be, yeah, it'd be nice to do it, but we'd like a second implementation, and that's will take too long, and we do it later or something.
As I said, it could also be a completely separate draft, because as I said, it modifies also the SSH client and the server and the agent. But we need to probably think about if there is anything. If you actually think about that extension now, we can actually make sure that it fits on there's nothing in there in the agent protocol that actually would break because of that, or would be. I don't want to update the agent protocol. Yes. I want to be extension the agent protocol and update the SSH client and server protocols.
Yeah, great. So we'll ask the question on the list and see where it goes.
Mitchell.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mitchell Durrell. I am one of the developers for HPN SSH, which is a soft fork of OpenSSH. I figured I would mention here, as far as the agent restrict, if OpenSSH has implemented that in master, then I don't know whether we count as another implementation or not, but we support everything you guys do. So if that counts as a separate implementation, then there are at least 2 out there then. So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to say I have read an older draft of the agent RFC, but I regret not being able to read the more recent ones before this meeting. I'm excited about the hardware key support. That's something that when I read the older draft a couple years ago, I actually reviewed it specifically with the intent of trying to add support for hardware key forwarding to remote devices, so that a remote device that needs that is trying to do 2-factor authentication, looking for a hardware token, can see one on my local machine. I'm not sure if the spec as it's stated would allow it to be used in that sort of a way. I hope it can, but I'll look into that on my own time. The question I have is something that may be in the spec or it may not be. If I am running the agent and I've got forwarded, and I'm using that agent to facilitate connection from host A to B to C, right? Let's suppose host C needs a different private key from host B. Host B is forwarding the agent connection along with it. Can host B see in plain text the private key that I'm using to connect into host C?
No, the private keys never leave the agent. They can see the public key that refers to the private key as the requests that you send go by, but they never see the private key material themselves. And this is really the crux of the security concerns around agent forwarding, is that I've went dark on the podium there. Once you've forwarded the agent, you've forwarded the agent, and any attacker on any of the hosts that you forwarded it to can steal use of the keys that are in the agent, but they don't get to steal the keys themselves.
Could this be so? Even stealing use of the keys, could that be avoided by encrypting communication between host A and C using host C's host key, for example?
Not trivially. The host keys are, in the SSH protocol, host keys are specified as signature keys, not as encryption keys. So it could you could build some you could build an encrypted SSH agent that kind of ran over the SSH protocol, but typically what I think typically what people do is they eschew forwarding the agent and generally make new SSH connections to the particular destination that they want. And there's like, at least in the OpenSSH implementation, there's a pretty easy facility for forwarding an encrypted SSH connection through machine that you have access to, and that encrypts the agent to that destination. So you're not, there's no hop. It provides a mechanism by which you avoid this hop by hop agent forwarding, which kind of increases your risk a bit.
That's the -J option.
Yes, aka proxy jump.
Yes. Okay. I'm definitely interested in ways to reduce how much I have to trust any intermediate hops, because I may trust that the intermediate hop for authentication with that hop specifically, trust host B for authenticating to host B, but I may not trust host B for much more than that. So I appreciate ways that I can limit the exposure of my credentials in that kind of a way. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just check out the URL that's on the screen at the moment, then, because that's how we've implemented it in OpenSSH, and I think that would be absolutely a good extension to discuss, either if at some point. I don't know whether we'll get to it in this draft, because it does require some fairly significant changes elsewhere in the stack, but I'd love to see that reviewed by the community and documented.
Yeah, I definitely will. Thank you.
Mitchell, to answer a question you asked at the start of your participation, whether HPN SSH counts as a second implementation. As I understand it, HPN SSH is a patch set on top of OpenSSH, and it changes some of the characteristics of the program. So if that patch set re-implements the SSH agent protocol, yes, I would count it as a separate implementation. But if HPN SSH uses OpenSSH's agent protocol code verbatim, I'd struggle to consider that a separate implementation. On the other hand, it is good that you share with us that SSH agent protocol features are available in HPN SSH, because it gives us an indication of deployment in the wild, even though the code was not a separate implementation effort. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, I can say, so we, over the past couple of years, we stopped distributing it as a patch set, because maintaining it as an independent patch set was too difficult. But we are now, we merge in all of OpenSSH's changes directly. We are still directly based on OpenSSH. We call ourselves a soft fork. And the changes that we have made to it, we don't touch any of the SSH agent capabilities at all, as far as I'm aware, at least not at this point. So no, I've not personally even looked at the SSH agent code, and neither has my colleague, as far as I'm aware. But we're not technically a patch set anymore, but I still don't think that, based on the spirit of what you were saying, that we should count as a separate implementation then.
For this particular aspect of SSH, of course.
So,
right.
You may want to update the FAQ on your website, because it says HPN SSH is a patch set, and that's why I got the information.
Yes. Indeed, our website is in dire need of updates. Yes, we are. That's something that I've been pushing lately.
You're not alone.
So I think there's actually two different meanings of the multiple implementations. So there's one meaning that is IETF point of meaning to implement independent implementations, meaning that you have two people reading the same specification and writing the code. And this clearly isn't that. But then there's also what we are talking about in our charter. We were saying that we want to have something that is widely implemented in multiple implementation, and that's this clearly is, if we have lots of forks that are using the same base code, and it actually is, actually almost all of them are based on something like an SSH from one fork of what OpenSSH did in 98 or 7 from SSH Communications Securities Code. Most of them are forks of that in the beginning. so in that sense, but there are lots of different implementations out there that are sharing some code, but writing their own code a lot, and depending on the implementation, there might be some, like, I assume, for example, the post-quantum stuff, people are implementing that in different sets, and there are going to be implementations, even if all of them are actually using base OpenSSH. They might be using OpenSSH and create a patch set to add a post-quantum stuff for that. I understand that was actually one of the things that were done earlier for one of the post-quantum things.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Any other questions or comments on this draft right now? So Damien, do you have a idea, view, preference for the future history of this draft? Get it all done by next week. It might take 6 months. It'll be 10 years.
I've got a. I'll tell you what the backlog is, and then I'll try to look forward a little bit. There's been a few comments since it's been posted on the SSHM working group mailing list that I've yet to incorporate. I have to rename it. So I will, in the next day or two, I'll get a new version of the draft under the new name that incorporates that feedback pushed. And then I guess the question, I've heard one opinion on whether this should be standards tracker informational. I'd like to canvass that on the mailing list a little bit more. I don't think there's much in this, I don't think there's really anything in here which is particularly controversial. It's very widely implemented. It mostly, except for extensions and new key types, it's mostly static in the subset that's documented here. So I think this is something which we could move reasonably quickly on if there's consensus to do so.
Great. Okay, so kind of an all going well, this could be something that might get moved along to the publication process in some months, kind of thing.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just it's all volunteer effort, so nice to have a kind of a goal. Great.
Any other questions or comments for Damien, SSH agent? All right. Thank you, Damien. We move on to the next agenda item. I would like to invite Theo.
Yeah.
Let's see, you're a little bit taller.
This was ready for you, Deb. Had it ready for you.
Make sure it's
Okay.
talking to the microphone.
Sure. Okay. So some talk has happened between Damien and Simon in the PuTTY group, and we think the working group should start discussing how to remove some of the older ciphers that are in the RFC. So something's going to happen in the next month. The open source developers are going to get together, and we'll discuss various things. And one of the things we'll do is we'll compare notes on what ciphers we've already removed from our implementations. And what I'd like to do is we'd like to come back with a list of non-contentious ciphers as a first draft, so we can rapidly figure out the process for how to go and update just that part of it. We currently have a whole bunch of new ciphers which are coming in, and then we'll have the old ones we remove, and we're going to have to find a middle ground in there, I think. I'm wondering if there's anybody who wants to start talking with us just in the background first, just so we can make that first list, and then we'll bring that first list to the mailing list as a discussion. Does that sound like a good way of doing this? Okay, like the list is pretty clear, like the initial ones, like this triple des as being the only mandatory stream cipher. There's DSSs in there, and there's no functional kex in there either, okay? Now, something else I think we should also discuss is how we're going to remove these things. There may be a difference between the server, what a server proposes, and what a client requests. Like there are, SSH sometimes ends up on devices for 20 years, and people still want to be able to log into them. So people would like to use, with optional configuration, they'd like to use their client to be able to log into a 20-year-old device. because otherwise they're going to use Telnet. Okay, so we can't. We have to resolve this in some way. So I think we may want to end up with something which is not quite like the IANA lists, where server and client have different perspectives. So this is a little bit different. Like we permit something, but we would discourage it. We would do this for the, we'd have that rule different for the client and for the server. Just this is just a thought. I think we're going to have to talk about this because we don't want to lock anybody else out for their legacy usage patterns. So I want to also mention something else. That Gwendy.de site, which lists all the ciphers, it cannot be used as a resource for this. It's been kept very up to date when new ciphers show up or new pieces of SSH support, but it's never been updated when, well, it's been very poorly updated when things are removed. So it provides, it doesn't provide very good explanation of what's actually going on. It has to be looked more closely. That's why I think we're going to have discussions with developers as to what their experience and why they made the decisions were in the past. So that's what I'm hoping that what I've said over here is a good process for us to go and attack that.
Tero Kivinen, in IPsec ME, we have been doing similar type. We have done this cryptographic algorithm requirements and usages documents. We update it every 5 years or something like that. And I would propose that SSH should do the same. It should have a document that lists these are the mandatory to implement algorithms, these are should not, and so on. But I also recommend that don't remove them from the code, allow them to be configured in, because I have ended up in cases where I actually had to use Telnet because the only cipher that was supported was something that wasn't supported by my 20-year-old SSH client. But the host key was so short that OpenSSH refused to connect to it. And there is no configuration option to say that allow these 768-bit host keys. So I had to use Telnet. I think the 768-bit host key would probably be safer than Telnet anyway. But, you know, so making sure, because there is lots of this was actually only, 10 years old, switch, hard network switch that is using SSH and Telnet. So I use Telnet, but so we need to make sure that we are really saying that this client should be able to be configured to use whatever. Server should, for server side, you can actually turn off the configuration because I don't think there's any need to support 20 years old clients. We need to support, very old servers we need to support. So client side should be, and of course, in most of the implementations, they are so tied together that you actually have the same. But the defaults, what you allow, are going to be different and should be different. And I don't think any of these should be actually the weak ciphers or old ciphers should be enabled by default, but they should be able to enabled by Godwin. We need to be very clear on that when we are actually writing the specification or the document to say this. And one of the things that actually SSA or IPsec does, it also has this notion of must plus or must minus and should plus and so on, meaning that for example, we haven't tripled this now as a must. We probably wouldn't want to move it to should mean minus, meaning that it's currently should because it's still so many devices, but we're actually going down with that. And then we have some must cipher, and then we might have a couple of other must plus cipher, or sorry, should plus cipher, meaning that these are new and they should be, getting, perhaps in the next 5 years, they will actually go to be the mandatory implement ciphers. And I think this notion was actually good. So if you think about that, that would be actually one way of doing it. And you can actually check out what kind of documents IPsec ME has already about this.
Okay. Yeah. Well, look, I'll definitely go look at them. I've seen those tables. I'll look at them a bit closer. I think we should definitely take an incremental approach towards getting there, though. So let's start with the easiest ones first, and then compare notes, and then try to add a couple more and compare notes, and just incrementally get somewhere.
Damien is next in queue.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of thoughts on this because I'm a fan of this work. I'm a fan of it because it makes implementation simpler And I think simplicity of implementation is one of the things that the SSH protocol really has going for it. And it also has some downstream effects on the cryptographic libraries that we depend on. They benefit if we remove old bad cryptography, then the downstream cryptography libraries can also do the same, and that further discourages the use of bad crypto. I think I'm cognizant also of the user pain that removing crypto that is still used in old devices can cause. I experience that myself too, but I think some degree of frustration there is an acceptable price to pay for having an implementation that is maintainable and is free of foot guns for users. Particularly on the server side, I think if we can reduce the attack surface on the server by removing cryptography which is known bad or known weak, then that's a win.
Rich?
Yeah, Rich Salzakam, I think this makes sense. I think going slowly, doing it in steps and saying, from the beginning that we're doing this in steps is a good idea. The other thing I like is that I think the developer community for OpenSSH is probably closer to the end user community than many of us here in the room are, right? I know how we use it, but I don't know how anybody else uses it. So not breaking clients or saying, hey, it's not as good as Route 13, but it's better than Telnet. That's a good thing to be able to do. So definitely distinguishing between what the clients should or must do as a separate thing from what the servers should or must support. I think the clients need to support a wider range because you have a large deployed base. So yeah, go for it. And yes, I'd like to be involved in the chats.
Next up, Tobias.
So, Tobias Sivic, I would like to kind of disagree with the wider support for things in the clients. I fully agree with the argument, like if OpenSSH strips down things, upstream libraries can also strip down things. And it might be more of an implementation issue to have like a doing -stupid -things SSH client as a separate packet, which then has like all this old code, which people for those special use cases can use. But the thing that is like the core of this is kept slim.
So I'll add a comment about that. Over in Debian land, they've actually made the client versions which actually have the old features. And then it rots and becomes 4-year-old clients. And so now you have, now you're not picking up bug fixes, which are important outside the Cypher space. So I'm uncertain if that strategy actually works, because, I mean, it's a decision that was made by downstream, and so they're perhaps not cognizant of the risks that it brings in because they're not on the protocol and the full development process. So I don't know. I don't know if having additional clients like that maintained is the right way.
So my idea would then be to have this done by the people who like are closer to it, like kind of like a retirement home for algorithms.
Mitchell?
So I definitely support deprecating old ciphers that are no longer secure. That seems like a very good idea. But I have embedded networking gear or embedded SSH servers and networking gear right behind me, enterprise grade gear that is very, very expensive. Yes, it's older now, but it does not support, the only ciphers it supports are deprecated ones, not for the main connection, I believe for the host key. I don't recall exactly what the problem was. That was frustrating, but it's not a huge issue for me because I am comfortable compiling and installing my own software and things like that. But not everyone who may need to log in and reconfigure some network gear may have that capability, or somebody may need to access something from a host where they may have very limited privileges. So I'm not entirely sold on the idea of removing the deprecated or the old ciphers entirely. I do think it's okay to break automation and scripts though. So I'm thinking perhaps a separate binary, SSH legacy, SSH old, something like that, could be distributed with the primary implementations in order to retain the ability to use these features, but without requiring people to have to jump through too many hoops in order to use them. The bigger question, though, about whether this is feasible and was partially related to the motivation to removing them, does keeping around these older ciphers add a maintenance burden for developers?
So comments in the chat from Bob Beck is, yes, it is a maintenance burden.
So then is that burden worth inconveniencing the people who need to access that old hardware then? And I don't know.
I think we should take that to a later discussion. Let's make a list of the non-contentious ones and then find out if any of them are contentious.
Damien, you had another comment?
Yeah, I just a perspective on the old server, on the server that like the switch gear that implements only like really old and bad crypto, and this notion that Telnet's better than nothing. SSH is better than Telnet for these things. I guess my feeling is that if the vendor hasn't maintained their SSH implementation for 20 years and updated it to something approximating moderately recent cryptography, then they probably haven't maintained that SSH implementation for correctness and implementation bugs. I think, and it's probably not safe to have exposed in any way. So I kind of see like only implementing old bad crypto as a kind of proxy smell for not having kept up to date more generally, and a signal that perhaps these things shouldn't be allowed anywhere where people can be making arbitrary SSH connections to them anyway.
So Tobias, again, I would actually like to echo Damien's point, and I think there's a certain degree of enablement there for certain enterprises that ship software that is really hard to maintain as a user, that does not have a clear upgrade path, where I, as a user, even if I want to, cannot upgrade that server that is in my, for example, ILOM. And I'm not sure whether it's the right path to accept being inconvenienced by those vendors.
Mitchell?
Just to mention that the switchgear in particular that I was referring to, that I've mentioned here, it is locked down in such a way that it is only, the switch only accepts SSH connections from a trusted intranet, where really the security of the SSH connection, it could be plain text. The cipher is completely irrelevant at this point. The SSH is strictly used as a way of managing the server, and without being able to get into it initially, Telnet was not enabled by default either. I ended up having to use a hardware console cable in order to get into the switch to do the initial configuration. So sometimes Telnet is not even a valid alternative. You may literally have to reach for hardware.
So Tobias has to bend down, but I
Can
can
you,
sit too. Yeah. So you all are tall. I'm just short. It's okay. Shoot, now I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, so this is so on the server end, obviously new servers, you can mandate that they use modern cryptography, right? Easy peasy. Old servers, you can't do a lot about. Clients, you have to support them all because that's the way clients work. Is there a way to do your clients so that you don't have everything installed all the time?
The way we have it is that the client has all of the ciphers linked in, compiled in. But the default tables don't use all of the ciphers for talking to a server. If you're talking to a server which has very legacy algorithms, you have to use options passed to the client to optionally add in particular kexts or key type or cipher.
So you have to do it,
You have to have manual arguments to the SSH client.
something you have to do to make it do that. So you
Right.
can't fall back to something
It will not,
awful.
that's right. It will not fall
but
back.
automatically.
It will not use the old unless you request it.
Okay.
Now, part of, I guess, what Bob Beck was mentioning earlier on as to whether it's an effort, for the OpenSSH developers, it's almost no effort to keep these things in the tables and link them into our binaries. But the libraries have to supply them. So Bob Beck is also coming from the perspective of a library developer, and they'd like to start removing some of the old ciphers from the libraries.
Small
So there's a
interjection.
friction.
Libraries in this context is like Boring SSL or LibreSSL or OpenSSL.
Yeah. That's the way I think of libraries.
Yeah. So it's a real struggle. We have a user base which will still go put old Cisco Catalyst switches on their intranet, and they're going to want to SSH to those devices because many years ago they discovered that their telnet servers on those machines were very poor. They discovered the telnet clients they had vulnerabilities as well, and so they turned telnet off on their boxes. So if we now suddenly transition SSH to not be able to talk to those things on those intranets, we're going to end up with a very hostile user community who can't talk to those things. Now we're almost in a situation where, well, OpenBSD will probably be the first operating system to completely remove the telnet client because we don't use it for anything anymore. Because everybody who has a device which has telnet and SSH has turned off their telnet and only left on their legacy SSH. Now, to log into those legacy devices, I have to use special SSH options, but that's fine because at least I have a way to connect to it other than a serial port.
So better that than turning telnet back on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think as long as there's manual things that you have to do as a operator to enable the old cruddy stuff, then I mean it's already there, right? Just don't take it out. And Bob Beck will object. Which is fine.
Something else we could do is we could update the RFCs to not list these old algorithms. Under the SSH code points, since they're just strings, they'll keep existing. They'll still be supported. They'll just be extensions beyond the RFC. It's established de facto practice, which will slowly go away in time. And it doesn't hurt anybody if the RFC just doesn't document them anymore.
I'd be curious to see what Bob says about that.
Well, we're in luck. He's next in queue. Bob.
For the most part, yes, what Theo says is my concern about this. But I think where we will naturally potentially see this pain sort of happen, and so I'm kind of putting on the hat of somebody not thinking like an SSH implementer, but somebody thinking about a library implementer. If I start ripping DES support out of a cryptographic library that OpenSSH starts to use, now OpenSSH can't use that crypto library, or OpenSSH has to pick up that support itself and maintain it itself. And I think what we will probably naturally see is that if the major cryptographic libraries want to keep support for old deprecated crypto, either stays in the main libraries or they take it away from the main libraries because they don't see a good use for it. And things that need this have to just maintain their own copies of this. Or maybe we see another cryptographic library that is lib bad crypto. I don't know, and everybody uses that. We could have. Hey, Rich, you want to do another fork? But so I mean, I'm all for, you know, let's. I mean, I'm fully supportive of, yeah, there's definitely a reason to have a long tail of client support. I think it's just really a question of how long is that long tail, and how long do we need it, and what do we minimally need to maintain. I think we can have this discussion on the list. So,
Damien?
Just a quick comment because I've talked enough. I guess a few people have talked about supporting stuff in the client, but not in the server. From an implementation perspective, if you support it in the client, you basically have to support it in the server because you need to be able to test it. So, you know, maybe that's in a test profile and gets compiled out for the releases that we ship or whatever. But as far as the benefits to maintainability from deprecating crypto, those benefits only really accrue. Those benefits only really accrue when you deprecate it in both, in my opinion.
Joseph?
My name is Joseph Nicholson. I'm with NTT Data. Unlike everybody else in here, I'm an actual operator and a network engineer and automation engineer. Damien, please don't break my automation. Something I want to point out is when you start messing with the clients, yeah, things do break. And as Mitchell was talking about earlier, you know, long-lived hardware that sometimes for many, many reasons just doesn't get removed, starts to become problematic. You know, I mean, up to 5 years ago, we even had a switch in the network that didn't even support SSH. It was still telnet only. We are now a non-telnet, you know, network. Not only that, but we have many pieces of hardware across many vendors, across many models, across many software revisions, and you know, as much as we try to keep those up to date, you know, if you start removing things out of the client, that means we have to start testing and qualifying. In, you know, it's going to take much longer to roll out updates and stuff. Not only the hardware and software side for the routers and the network devices, but you know, with automation now, using Ansible, using Python, using everything else, that's even more that we have to test and qualify and verify works with every single update to that. And not to mention our SaaS teams with our VMs and our servers and everything else that also have to be tested because they all interact with the network. So.
Okay. 3 minutes to go. Any closing words?
I think we're going to take a very conservative approach. That's my guess. Thank you.
Thanks. Speaking as chair about the proposed proceedings, I think you know, essentially picking any one non-controversial algorithm to figure out how is it actually that we remove these is a great way to explore this process and will help us in future investigations and studies of maintaining the list of algorithms and ciphers that we use in SSH. So I thank you for the initiative.
Okay. So we have the two other drafts, probably just worth a brief mention, on Entru and on MLChem. And so this, as you saw on the list, the status of the Entru one is that we figured there was consensus to adopt that, so we've done it. There, I guess, will be some discussion about, you know, whether it becomes informational or whatever. We'll kick off that discussion on the list. Simon wasn't available, unfortunately, and the same is true for Panos on the MLChem draft, where he said he wants to update it, and then he'll ask us to do a call for adoption, and we'll do that, hopefully in the next short while. So we should get the post-quantum story moving along nicely, hopefully in the not too distant. And if need be, we can organize an interim meeting or something to discuss that kind of thing. Probably early new year or something. That's the most likely time that'd be an interim meeting for pretty much any IETF working group at the minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just the status on those. We didn't have presenters. That it? I think we're at the any other business part of the agenda.
1 more minute.
So any other business? If not, great. And Tara.
Just
I forgot. I didn't have time to put myself in the queue because.
That's okay.
So I actually think we should take the latest version of the file transfer draft, not the very old one. The latest one is backward compatible with it. It says that, okay, if you support version 3, do that. Because I would hate to see, for example, the client I'm using, for example, Windows, do support, version 3 and support version 6, which is the latest one. And, having features, disappearing there because we decided that to go and, standardize the old version, not the version that they implemented.
So this is the one that was like where the internet draft got way ahead of the reality. Is it the draft we're talking about?
Yep.
No, it's the internet draft. The internet draft was, the features that were added were useful for Windows use.
Okay.
They were not useful for, for Linux use that much, which means that OpenSSH never implemented that. But my understanding is that most of the Windows versions actually did do that because they are very important when you are actually doing graphical user face type of thing where you have multiple file transfer going at the same time.
I guess we're out of time, so.
Yeah, one of the things they added, for example, the request IDs to say that, okay, if you send the request, you get the request, and then you get the reply.
I think we're over time already, so I guess that's one to bring to the list, and we'll talk about it on the list.
Yep.
So sorry, Mitchell, we're kind of out of time. People are going to run off and get snacks.
I would like to thank
Thank
you
you
all
for
for participating in our very, very first working group meeting. Much appreciated. I hope to see you in Thailand, Bangkok, I think. Somewhere
Or
in
an
Thailand.
interim in between time as well.
So yeah, thank you everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Well done.
Sufficiently boring.
Good. We'd like to please. I did it. So it wasn't a big agenda, so it's gonna.
The old algorithms, it is
That's a pain
such
in
an
the ass.
asinine thing because